All right, strap in, everybody. We're going deep on this one. We're diving into the conflict in Ukraine and how it's reshaping global power. We got some interesting sources lined up, a Ukrainian talk show and some articles from big U.S. publications. And what's crazy is how, even though they're coming from such different angles, they all kind of point to the same unsettling trends.
It really is remarkable how these different perspectives converge, especially with the new Trump administration adding a whole other layer of complexity.
For sure. So let's start with this bombshell report about the State Department.
Yeah.
They've basically frozen spending on almost all foreign aid for the next 90 days. It's like they just hit the pause button on helping other countries.
Yeah, this stop work order, they're calling it, covers almost everyone except for Israel and Egypt. It really makes you question what this means for America's commitment to its allies going forward.
And you know what's wild? The article mentioned that people inside the State Department are freaking out. They're worried about potential lawsuits because of all these contracts they suddenly can't fulfill.
Yeah.
It's like this move blindsided everyone.
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows. And it's particularly worrying for countries like Ukraine, Jordan, and Taiwan, who rely heavily on U.S. aid. This sudden shift could leave them in a very vulnerable position.
Speaking of vulnerability, that's a theme that came up a lot in the Ukrainian talk show we looked at. The expert they had on was basically saying that Ukraine is caught in the middle of this power struggle between the U.S. and Russia. Like, their fate depends on what those two superpowers decide.
It's a chilling thought. He believes the outcome of the war hinges on some kind of grand bargain between the U.S. and Russia, and Ukraine might end up as the bargaining chip.
Yeah, and he didn't hold back on his thoughts about President Trump. He's concerned that this whole America First agenda means that Trump might be willing to sacrifice Ukraine's interests to secure a deal with Putin.
And that's where Trump's communication style comes into play, right? He's all about deal-making and personal relationships with leaders like Putin. The expert we're talking about worries that those relationships might take priority over what's best for Ukraine.
It's like he's running the country like one of his businesses, and Ukraine is just a pawn in his game. And speaking of Trump style, another article highlighted how different his approach to communication is. It's like a mix of business jargon and showmanship. He's constantly talking about strength and decisiveness.
It's definitely a departure from how we've seen presidents communicate on the world stage before. Whether this translates into concrete policy decisions, though, remains to be seen.
Now, everyone's buzzing about this letter Trump sent to Putin. The Ukrainian talk show host had a lot to say about it.
Well, to give some context, the letter basically expressed Trump's desire to find a negotiated settlement to end the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, and the talk show host seemed to think that this letter signals that the war might be ending soon. But his concern is that it'll end on Russia's terms, leaving Ukraine in a very precarious position.
It's that age-old dilemma of wanting peace, but fearing the potential cost of that peace, especially if it means making concessions that could compromise their independence in the long run.
The host also had this interesting observation about the changing world order. He thinks we're moving away from a system based on rules and global institutions and towards a system where it's all about power. Like the big countries just call the shots and everyone else has to fall in line.
And if that's the case, it has huge implications for smaller countries like Ukraine. They might not have the same level of protection they've relied on in the past.
And to make matters worse, there's this news about a directive from the Department of Homeland Security. They're putting a hold on these programs that allow immigrants to temporarily live in the U.S., including a really important one for Ukrainians seeking refuge.
It's a worrying development, especially given the ongoing conflict. It suggests that the U.S. might be stepping back from its role as a safe haven for people fleeing war and persecution.
And this affects immigrants from other places too, like Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela. It's a really complex situation with a lot of moving parts.
What's interesting is how all these threads seem to be connecting. We're seeing this uncertainty in U.S. foreign policy, a potential weakening of global institutions, and smaller countries getting caught in the crossfire.
Exactly. And this brings us to the big question. What happens to a country like Ukraine in this new world order? They're fighting a war, and now their main ally, the U.S., seems to be pulling back. What are they supposed to do?
Well, their president, Zelensky, has acknowledged that they might have to negotiate with Russia. He even mentioned the possibility of returning to the pre-2022 borders, which is a huge concession.
But at the same time, he's still asking for more military support from the West.
Yeah.
It seems like he's trying to walk a very fine line.
It highlights the incredibly tough spot Zelensky is in. On the one hand, he wants a just peace. But on the other, he can't ignore the reality of Russia's military power.
And the talk show host was pretty skeptical about the role of international organizations like NATO. He doubts they can actually offer much protection, especially with Trump's America First agenda in play.
It reflects this growing disillusionment with the effectiveness of these institutions in a world where power dynamics are shifting so dramatically.
And to top it all off, the talk show really drove home this point about Russia's military production. They're actually outpacing Europe, which doesn't bode well for Ukraine's chances of winning this war outright.
That assessment certainly raises the stakes. If Ukraine can't match Russia's military might, their options become much more limited.
And then you've got Trump, the ultimate wild card. The talk show host is convinced that his America First policy will translate to less support for Ukraine, which puts them in an even more precarious position.
And that aligns with what we've seen from the Trump administration so far, especially this pause on foreign aid. It points to a more transactional approach to foreign policy where the U.S. is putting its own interests first, no matter the consequences for others.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak picture. Makes you wonder where it all leaves Ukraine.
I mean, you remember how that expert on the Ukrainian talk show, how he compared Ukraine to a ship that's run aground?
Yeah, that really stuck with me.
It really does capture that feeling of being stuck, totally at the mercy of these bigger forces.
Right. So then the question is, how do they get unstuck? How do they get back in control?
Well, the expert had some ideas, although I don't know how comforting they were. He was talking about the need for Ukraine to, be more practical, more willing to compromise, even if it means making deals that aren't, ideal.
Tough pill to swallow, right? I mean, this is a country that's fought tooth and nail for its independence.
I know. But his point was that, clinging to some perfect outcome could actually lead to even worse consequences.
Yeah. He even went so far as to say that Ukraine needs to figure out how to play by Trump's rules, which means understanding his whole transactional style of diplomacy.
Yeah, all about personal relationships and using threats and incentives to get what he wants.
Right. And the expert wasn't just talking about diplomacy. He also challenged these traditional ideas of, winning and losing. He thinks those lines are getting blurrier in the 21st century.
Right. It's not just about conquering territory anymore. It's about information warfare, economic pressure, shaping the narrative.
Exactly. So he was basically saying that Ukraine needs to think bigger than military solutions. They need a strategy that includes things like economic resilience, diplomatic maneuvering, and I guess maybe even some kind of accommodation with Russia.
It's a huge ask, especially for a country fighting for its existence, but it does show how important it is to have a more flexible and adaptable approach to resolving conflict these days.
And it's interesting how he connected this back to the idea that the global order is changing. He didn't seem very optimistic about organizations like NATO being able to provide real security anymore.
That skepticism, it's definitely something we're seeing more and more. This concern that these old institutions, these rules-based systems, they just aren't that effective anymore, especially with these power shifts happening so fast.
Yeah. It was like his main message was Ukraine can't just rely on outside help. They need to focus on their own internal strength, becoming more resilient.
More self-reliant.
Right. And his comments on, justice in this new world order, those were pretty thought-provoking. He was saying that it might actually be counterproductive to get too hung up on some ideal vision of justice.
Almost like sometimes you have to temper idealism with pragmatism.
Especially when lives are at stake.
Exactly.
It's like achieving perfect justice just might not be possible in a world where power calls the shots. And in that kind of situation, maybe the best you can do is try to get a negotiated settlement, even if it means making compromises.
Yeah. I mean, it's a hard truth, but it makes you think about the realities of international relations.
And then there's the whole issue of Ukraine's military capabilities compared to Russia's. And the talk show host was really blunt about that.
Yeah, no sugarcoating there. He pointed out that Russia's churning out weapons and ammunition way faster than Europe, and that puts Ukraine at a huge disadvantage if this war drags on.
Absolutely. And it really emphasizes how much Ukraine relies on continued military and financial support from the West.
Yeah, that's critical for them. But like we said earlier, there's no guarantee that support will continue, especially with the Trump administration being so unpredictable.
And their America First policy.
Right. So if you combine the experts' analysis with what we've already seen from the Trump administration, it's not the most optimistic picture for Ukraine.
It feels like they might be facing a future where they're going to have to make some really, really tough decisions just to survive.
Decisions about territory, maybe giving up on being neutral, even finding some way to coexist with Russia.
And this is all happening while the United States seems to be pulling back from its role as, the world's police,
Right, that leaves a vacuum. And we're seeing countries like Russia and China moving to fill it.
which makes the world a lot more unstable and unpredictable.
Yeah. It feels like the old rule book has been thrown out, and nobody knows what the new rules are.
Which brings us back to that prediction from the Ukrainian talk show host, that we're heading towards a new world order where power is everything.
Might makes right.
Exactly. And smaller countries are just going to have to try to survive.
It's a sobering thought. Like, if you can't depend on traditional alliances and institutions anymore, how do these smaller nations even protect themselves in this new world?
It's a question we really need to grapple with.
Mhm.
I mean, as we try to make sense of all these global changes, I think we have to keep asking ourselves, what does this new reality mean for international relations? How will power be used? And what happens to the countries that don't have enough of it?
Those are the big questions that are going to shape the geopolitical landscape for a long time to come.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. I mean, it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by all of this.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that even with these huge challenges, there's still hope. Humans are incredibly resilient. And history shows us again and again that even in the darkest of times, we find ways to adapt, to innovate, to move forward.
Yeah. We can't give in to despair. We have to engage with these issues, thoughtfully and critically, and be determined to find solutions, even if they're not perfect.
That's exactly what we're trying to do here on The Deep Dive, to give our listeners the tools to understand this crazy world we live in.
Right.
We're not trying to tell anyone what to think.
Right.
We just want to spark people's curiosity, get them thinking critically.
Help them be more informed and active in the global conversation. It is heavy stuff. This whole deep dive, it's taken us through some pretty intense stuff. I mean, war, changing alliances, this idea of a whole new world order emerging.
Right. And we didn't even get into the economic side of things. One of the articles we looked at, it talked about how this whole stop work order on foreign aid, it could actually end up hurting the U.S. economy.
Yeah, the article mentioned American companies, NGOs, they depend on these foreign aid contracts. And now everything is just kind of on hold.
So it could mess up supply chains, hurt businesses,
Yeah.
and that would have a ripple effect, right?
Exactly. Like, it's not just about a moral obligation to help other countries. We live in such an interconnected world now. What happens over there, it really does affect us over here. There are real economic consequences to think about.
Yeah, it just shows how complicated and unpredictable things are getting. Like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape.
Right. And for me, that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion,
And sometimes what you find under those layers is a little unsettling, like that prediction from the Ukrainian talk show host,
Mm-hmm.
That we're heading towards a world where power is everything.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what role can a country like Ukraine even play in a world like that? Are they just going to be pawns in a game played by these bigger countries?
Well, the expert we were talking about, he seemed to think that Ukraine still has a choice, that they can still influence what happens to them, but they have to think differently, be more strategic.
He kept using that analogy of the ship run aground.
Right.
It's like he was saying, Ukraine's got to figure out how to get refloated somehow, even if it means making some tough compromises.
And I think the insights we've gotten from all these sources, they're relevant for all of us, not just Ukraine. Like, if the rules really are changing, then we all need to adapt, right? We all need to understand what's going on and how to engage with the world in this new reality.
I know, it's a lot.
It is.
This deep dive, it's definitely been an eye-opener for me. I feel like I have a better understanding of just how connected everything is and how decisions made in one place can have these huge effects on the other side of the world.
It really drives home the point that we're all part of this global system. And what we do, individually and collectively, it matters. Our actions have consequences.
So as we wrap things up here, I'm curious, what are your big takeaways from this deep dive? What's sticking with you?
I think for me, the biggest thing is just the sheer scale of the change that's happening right now. Like, we are seeing a fundamental shift in how power works in the world. And honestly, it's not clear where it's all going to lead. It's both exciting and scary at the same time. And I think we all need to stay informed, stay engaged, and be flexible as we navigate this new landscape.
That's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the knowledge and the tools to understand this complex world. We're not here to tell you what to think.
Right.
We want to help you think for yourself.
Yeah.
To be curious.
Yeah.
To ask questions.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning, because the world is changing fast. And the more we understand about those changes, the better prepared we'll be to face whatever challenges come our way.
And to seize the opportunities.
Exactly.